Imagine a creative conference in Spain where the program is actually ahead of time instead of behind. It's awesome, fascinating. First data point. Second data point, and I thought I'd throw a few in today, just to show how behavior is changing, how it's interesting. Did you know that 26% of people that often use a voice assistant at home, like a Siri or a Amazon Echo, that 20% of people that own such a device have sexual fantasies of the device? So, you know, think about me tooing that in the future. Anyway, I want to introduce you to the next speaker, which is Helge Tenno. I know Helge from a long time, and I don't know Helge. This is what social media did to us a couple of years ago, where you start, recognizing people online and you thought they have a really interesting opinion. And Helge is one of those smart people. He would always come up with really smart presentations. You're like, fuck, this dude is smart, that's really intelligent. And so that means that the first thing Helge will have to explain before he starts talking is where his website originates from, because I'll read you. Helge's URL is 180360720.no. How do you remember that? So
I know.
Give it up for Helge Tenno.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll answer that first. I'm really, really bad with names. So this was in 2007. I had a blog which was called 2010, and I understood that this was going to not be about the future. It would soon date, so I had to figure out a new name. And at this moment, my agency that I worked in at the moment, they were so focused on 360-degree advertising. I don't know if any of you remember this back in 2007, but it was basically doing TV and print and putting the internet on it. And I was so pissed off at this that I said, well, if you're going to do 360, why don't you do 180 or 720? And that's why the address is 180, 360, 720. And I understood 3 years later that it looks like a spam address, but I'm stuck with it. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about input variables. And this is a half-baked idea, and the presentation is rather messy, so I hope you're going to enjoy it. What I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to help companies figure out what kind of data to put into their organization to make it tick. And working on this, I think there's a growing gap today between what organizations want to become and what data we put into it in order to achieve this. And so the first time I noticed this problem was working as a strategist in the advertising industry. And I could clearly see that if my strategy was poor, then the creative would be very poor. And if my strategy was good, then the opportunity for the creative to be much better was there. So the strategy was the creative was very dependent on the level of the strategy. But you could take it even further back. If the data and the insight is poor, then the strategy is poor. So wouldn't that apply to companies as well? If a company is feeding itself on poor data or poor insights or old data and old insights, wouldn't that just set the company up to believe they're doing a really good job at meeting the future? But in reality, they're just solving all problems. It looks clear, it looks good, because the data is there, you can touch it, it looks very, very handy and very, very nice. But in reality, we're just continuously trying to solve an old problem because the only data we have access to is old data. So that's the problem I'm trying to work with. So this is how I see myself. No, this is how I see organizations. I see organizations as two components, rather interconnected. And on the one side is the hardware and the OS. And that is the governance, the management, the teams and the talents, the coordination and the strategy and the innovation inside the organization. This is the hardware. This is how the organization is built. But on the other side, you have the fuel. What fuels this organization? This organization is, unfortunately, a lot of organizations are just set up to run independently based on their own internal mechanisms. But in order to have some kind of progress, you need to fuel it with something. You need to add something to the organization that makes it spin off and makes it turn into the things that you want, makes it go in the direction you want. And this is the data and the information and the experience that you put into the organization. And in my mind, we are at a loss, because currently we are trying to fuel this organization with the wrong type of data. We're trying to fuel our organizations and also our processes with the wrong type of data. Our imagination is limited to the tools that we use to understand the world. This should be quite a non-controversial assumption. So how do we know if the tools we are using to understand the world is good? So I'm looking at this industry, and I'm seeing there's so many brilliant people and there's so many good, talented people. And I'm not seeing a creative problem. I'm not necessarily seeing a strategic problem. I think one of the most brilliant people in the world are situated in these companies and in these organizations. But if you are fueling your organization based on the wrong data, if you're fueling your processes based on the wrong data, then the output will inevitably be poor. You're not going to get good results standing on top of shoddy data. And so this is the problem that I'm trying to solve, and this is when it becomes messy, because I haven't got a clue how to do it. I try to wrench my brain around it every day. I'm so certain that the hypothesis is right, that there's something in there that I must be touching upon. There's a nerve in there, but I haven't got a clue how to move forward. Just to tell you that this is it's a hypothesis, it's a theory. I'm hoping to inspire you to help me solve this problem. So I think in these organizations, we are, in essence, as human beings, we are expert-making machines. We are certainty-making machines. When I come to an organization, or I listen to an organization, and they say, we have all the data in the world. We are probably the best company in this country to understand the customers. And I'm looking at this data, and I'm thinking, how do you even know this data is the right data? You have amounts of data. Wow, you have really good, you have huge amounts of data. Everybody has to do a Trump analogy. You have huge amounts of data, but how do you know if it's right? And of course, if you have piles of valid data over here, and somebody is standing over here and telling you, but how do you know if it's right? Maybe it's something that you don't know. Then people start to get pissed off. So it's a difficult problem, but we are set up in order to refuse it. And this is why, I'm sorry, the clicker is a bit. And this is so this is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking we are using old tools and models to understand the world. So if you look at the models and the tools you're using today, if you go to your strategist and ask them, what kind of data are you using to understand our consumers, and when was this model built? When is this from? Most likely, she will say that, well, I don't know, or this is probably from the 1980s, 1990s, beginning of the 2000s. And then basically these models are designed to fish inside a very limited pool of customer insight. And we moved 25 years ahead, and what we're thinking is that I think the old pools are still there, but there are new pools. There's a pool over there that we need to look into. There's a pool over here that we need to look into. There's a pool over here. But the old models and methods are designed to go into the old pools. They are designed to figure out what's happening in the world if the world looked like the way it was. So we end up in a situation where we are very familiar and very confident about what we know, because the data is so certain. We are very confident about what we don't know that we know, because we can see clearly where the blind spots are. But we are not very familiar with what we don't know, we don't know.
There are reports that there is no evidence of a direct link between Baghdad and some of these terrorist organizations.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Okay. The interesting thing about making presentations is that you will find that there's a remarkable amount of American politicians that you could use as reference points, and not necessarily the good ones. Okay, so this is what I think. I think we are setting up organizations up to look brilliantly. It looks perfect because nobody is questioning. Everybody's experts, and nobody's questioning what we don't know. But this is the essence of capitalism. Every trend of capitalism just crashes directly into the wall because there is no mechanism to stop it. And this is what is happening at the moment. We are building efficiency machines that are ramping up the old world to such a speed that when we finally hit this wall, it will be so hard that the shock will be immense. And I think we are not trying to solve the future the way we're looking at the world today, the way we're fishing for data today. What I think we're just accelerating the machine, waiting for it to smash directly into the wall. So we're in the, I wouldn't say I think we're in trouble, but let me try to prove my point and have a little bit of fun with business people doing it. So 10 years ago, about 400 experts concentrated around one man or two people in Switzerland, and they said, let's try to put all our minds together and figure out what is an organization. What is the simplest format we could distill an organization into in order to have the quality to understand it, but also the flexibility to start to change it? And they said, well, when we look at the business, we can essentially scale it down to 9 elements. This is the business model canvas, probably familiar to many of you. But when they, 6 years later, said, well, hang on a minute, we did it for business, it was a blasting success. Let's try to do the same for people. Let's try to distill a human being down into as few components as possible in order to understand them as a customer. And they ended up with 3, which is basically the circle, because the square is how the company is supposed to respond to it. So when you ask business people, I don't even think they're interested in understanding their customers, but it seems that they have a very, very simple perspective of it. And there's so much details and so much data that's been lost in it, but of course, it's a canvas, it's a wonderful workshop tool, it looks very good, and your manager says it's okay. So, top of the pops to you. Okay, and this is what happens to organizations. So I'm trying to build the argument that you can clearly see that we're not that good at data. And so Clayton Christensen, the godfather of this disruption, he says that when we look at companies, we look at startup companies first. And startup companies, they are saying there's something wrong in the world. We have identified a human problem, and we're trying to figure out this problem and find a solution for it. So if you go to a startup conference, you will listen to these startups, and they're trying the best they can to explain to you that there's a problem in the world, we have identified it, it's complex, it's messy, it's difficult to understand, but we think we got the hang of it, and we think we made the solution, this box, to help people solve it, which is good. But when companies mature, they get very confident and very good at what they do. They become experts. And so it's not that much about understanding people anymore. It's about making the organization much more efficient. And so they tend to leave the complicated, messy, weird data that you find when you're really looking at customers, and they go for data that's measurable. In essence, I don't think it's even controversial to say that if the data about the customer does not fit into an Excel spreadsheet cell, it's not going to be used. So that's where we are. And so Christensen says when they leave this area in the outcome and they go into this area of efficiency, it becomes much more about products and competitors and features. So if you go to these same conferences that you listen to the startups with their messy tales about the customer, which are you believe them and you want them to succeed, and then the incumbent comes in, the big existing corporation, 20 years in the business, 120 years in the business, they will show you a map of Europe. And they will highlight every country they're number 1 in, and every country they're number 2 in. And this is the way they perceive their market. The customer does not even exist anymore. So companies become internal. They become, a company today is almost exclusively about efficiency and standardization. It's not about anything else.
The big challenge for us now as business people is how do we realign our commercial operations with these new needs? And it's very hard to do that from inside the old model, because the old model was created to keep consumers out. Those are extrinsic factors that we keep on the outside so they don't mess up our ability to be efficient and standardized and so on. So it's very difficult from within the current management system to reach out and realign with the needs of these new populations. However, when you see companies, entities that are actually doing it, you see enormous growth and success, an enormous release of economic value.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. What a hairdo. But the thing that she's talking about is really important. So she kind of tries to prove my point that I don't even think organizations are interested in looking for future data because they're so confident on the data that they have. So companies are essentially designed to keep customers out. Customers are extrinsic, they're friction, they're a problem. We have to keep them outside the company, which has become the problem at the moment because, well, as we know, companies are having to fuse more and more and more with their customers. You as agencies for other companies are having to fuse more and more with these companies, and these companies as well as having to listen much more to customers to try to understand them. And so I think our imagination is taken hostage by old code. I think customer insight today and customer and market insight and understanding today is basically a tax that leadership has to pay in order to prove to their management or their board of directors that they're doing the right thing. We didn't mess it up. We didn't do anything wrong. Look at the data. It says that this is the right thing to do. And nobody questions the methods and methodologies that we're using to create the data. And the problem is in that. The problem is in the fuel. It's not in the organizations. It's slightly in the organizations. It's not in the strategy. It's not in the creative. So again, we're continuing this thing of just running into the wall. We're accelerating into this wall, hitting a wall as hard as possible. And why is this a problem now? Because we've been doing this, not running into the wall, but we've been using this system of action for the last 40 or 50 or 100 or 117 years or so. Why is it important now? Because now we're in a shift. We are in a shift. This is not something that hasn't happened before. Happens almost every 100 years or so. Every 100 years or so, the content of capitalism changes. And the content of capitalism is the processes and practices that goes into creating value and wealth. And to make, I don't understand that, but to make it understandable, I'm stealing from Zuboff again, the hairdo woman, and she says that if you look back into the 1600s and 1700s, the processes that created wealth were mercantile capitalism. It was the Venetian traders and the Venetian merchants and the Dutch traders. 100 years later, it was the British imperialists and their factories and their proprietary capital. 100 years later, we went into the American managerialism, which we have been suffering under and prospered under for the last 100 years, but now we're moving into something new. We're moving into something called distributed capitalism. And this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. This is something that we're already 10 years into. And this means that if you look at the gigantic corporations of today, the way they are using their business processes and their practices to create wealth is completely different. This is what Shoshana Zuboff said in the hairdo film. She said the companies that are able to unlock this mystery, they are able to unlock mass amounts of wealth. And so this is what is happening. When we enter this situation, it's a real situation where the content of capitalism is changing. It's not a marketing ploy. It's something that's actually affecting our structure and our societies. And what happens is that we tend to cling on to old data. And so this old data, as I mentioned before, it looks really good, looks really nice, but the output of the data is innovation. And innovation is not the solution. Innovation is a disease. Because what happens with innovation is that you look at the old data and you try to force the customer to stick to the old paradigm. The customer is around here and he says, I want to go up here, I want to go into the Gartner hype cycle. And the company says, no, we're looking at the data, The data is telling us they don't want to go up there, they want to go down here. So we're inventing marginal improvements to what's already there, and we're forcing companies to spend enormous amounts of money by doing completely the wrong things. This is the innovation disease. And so, more practically, what's going to happen is that we're seeing already that there's a convergence of industries, which is a difficult word, but it means that what we're going to see for the next couple of years, and this is why the current model of data doesn't work anymore, is because industries are going to fall together. The example here is Amazon going into the grocery business because they want to sell the world to the world, Google going into the same business because they want to control their advertising setup. So it's an online retailer and a search algorithm company suddenly fighting for the same customers. And this is not only happening in those digital gigantic realms. If you look at business-to-business world and you look at the fertilizer market, and I hope many here are very comfortable with the fertilizing market. I'll give you an analogy, and I'll try to do it quite quickly. So Yara is a Norwegian company, and they do fertilizing. They make sacks, huge sacks of fertilizer that they take with a truck and deliver to the farmer. And when you go to Yara and you ask them, you say, what does your future look like? And half of the people at Yara, they would say, well, we are the best fertilizing producing company in the world. We will always be the best fertilizing producing company in the world. But if you go to the second half of Yara, they will be like, oh, really scared, because they're saying people or farmers don't buy fertilizer. Farmers wake up every morning, and they have a job to do, and that is to get as much as possible back from what they put in. And fertilizer is just an infrastructure component in that. It's probably one of the least important things. So Monsanto, which is not that good of an example, but it's a main competitor of Yara, they say, well, hang on a minute, we can do something about this. So they put IoT sensors into the farming equipment and the farmer's land, and then have sensors actively measuring the soil on each small part of their fields. And every day the farmer wakes up, opens up his Monsanto app, and it tells them where, how much, and with what to fertilize. So every day the farmer wakes up with Monsanto, and then every month, Yara comes into the farmer's yard and drops off a sack of fertilizer. So you can see how those customer relationships completely change. But then the convergence, then the mutation happens. Because John Deere, which is a tractor producer, they're saying, hang on a minute, they're putting all these sensors on our tractors. We can offer these tractors. So John Deere comes into the same segment. And then SAP, which is a German IT company, they're saying, hang on a minute, they're using our IT to solve these problems. We can do the same thing. So suddenly you have a fertilizer company, two fertilizer companies, a tractor company, and an IT company suddenly becoming exactly the same industry. And then all of these companies are looking at their data and saying, whoa, hang on a minute. We have such good data. You know what we can do next? We can sell insurance. Because we have much better risk data than any of the insurance companies. And suddenly everyone is just pouring into the insurance industry, insurance segment, and Allianz is sitting there and saying, we have no data at all about these fields. And you have John Deere, and they're all able to offer this farmer a much cheaper insurance, which a much higher risk rate than we ever could. So you can see all of these industries that were so orderly, that were so correct, that were so nice, they just suddenly just melt together. And then you have the consumer segment.
Hypothetically, imagine you're sitting at home and one day you notice your corgi is dirty. You open WeChat, hit a few buttons, and a few hours later a man shows up at your door with some shampoo and a big vacuum. Your dog gets cleaned and he looks great. You take a photo, you share it with your friends, and tag the dog cleaning business. You haven't left the app. Your friend who likes Hello Kitty and works a boring office job is slacking off at work and looking at WeChat. She sees the photo of your clean corgi. She decides she wants her poodle clean. She clicks the tag on your photo and orders the same service. Within seconds, the man with the big vacuum is on his way to her house. She pays him, and he's happy because he got paid instantly on WeChat. She starts chatting with you to thank you. Neither of you have left the app. While chatting, she tells you about a new hip noodle joint. She says, you have to come. It's a schlep, but you accept. She orders food while still at her desk. You order a taxi. She pays for the food. On the way to her house, the man with the big vacuum invests the money he earned from both of you into a wealth management product that's probably a little too risky. Neither of you nor the man with the big vacuum have left the app. Both of you arrive and the app tells the kitchen you're there. Your WeChat profile photo pops up on the wall. It's an old photo from the year you had that weird part in your hair. Of course she makes a comment. Your food is served. You notice your meat is a bit overcooked, so you snap a photo and post a disparaging restaurant review. You're already on your phone and you remember you still owe your friend money because she paid. You transfer her money. Neither of you, the man with the big vacuum, nor the restaurant have left the app.
Okay, so you remember I talked about the different chapters of capitalism, from the merchants to the proprietary British capitalism to the managerial capitalism of America and distributed capitalism. If you own the means of distribution, you own everything. because everything can be put onto your platform. And China is a bit different because it has been a closed system. So these super platforms have been much more aggressive there and managed to do what WhatsApp has done. But all the platforms that you are using, Facebook, Google, Amazon, all of them are trying to do the same thing, which is a huge problem for organizations, because how do we compete against this? How do we compete against possibly being eaten alive by a channel of distribution? And this is, again, where the problem with data comes in, because I don't call it industry convergence, I call it mutation, and that is mutations that upend industries can come from anywhere, and so conventional forms of market analysis and competitive strategy will miss completely those mutations. Nobody has data outside their own industry. Nobody has data outside their own field of vision. Nobody has data from different pools, but what is happening is all happening in different pools. Everything, the future is not in front of us, the future is outside of us. So we have to start looking at new perspectives and new pools of data, and then my critique is going to the models and methods we are using when we're trying to capture data, because they have been designed for the old system and to work in the managerial capitalism. They haven't been designed to function in a distributed capitalism. So I'm not seeing any company that actually has the right data or the right understanding of what's going to happen. And on the consumer side, and this is important because, again, the data is set up so well in order to capture a type of customer that doesn't exist anymore. And so what do I mean by that? So there's an old type of customer and there's a new type of customer. But what we're seeing in these shifts, these capitalistic shifts, is that they change the customer's demand pattern. What does that mean? A demand pattern is what you find valuable to pay for. It's the simplest way of explaining it. What we used to find valuable to pay for becomes a hygiene factor, and what we want to pay for becomes something new. So if you go back into this model that I've ripped off from Shoshana Zuboff again, and you can see that 100 years ago, this is what we're looking at is something called the premium puzzle. And 100 years ago, normal people like us, they came to the automakers, as an example, and they said, autos, cars, that is so cool. We want autos as well. And the automakers, they did like this, and they said, are you crazy? Do you know how much money it takes to make a car? There's just no way you're ever going to have access to a car because it's for rich people. It's not for you. And so, coincidentally, we got scientific management by Taylor, and we got electricity, and all of these and many other ideas got put together into a new type of manufacturing system that enabled us to reduce the price of cars so that everybody could have one. And this opened up enormous new markets. Cars was a luxury niche all the way up here with a really small segment, and suddenly enormous markets suddenly had access to cars. That was 100 years ago. What is happening today, 100 years later? What is the premium puzzle that we have to try to figure out today? Because our data is trying to figure out the premium puzzle down here. It hasn't been designed to figure out the premium puzzle up here. And this is where technology is really not that important anymore. Because the shift that has been happening for the last 100 years that has led us to this new chapter of capitalism, it's not a technological change, it's a societal change. It's a slow societal change. So we got, because of, and this is why mass production has led to enormous prosperity, because of mass production, we have had mass education. We have had access to goods. We have had material wealth. And all of these things put together are changing the society. It changes your demands for what you want to pay for. So 30 years ago, if you could buy an orange in June in Norway, you had to be very, very rich. Today, you can go into any store at any time and pick up an orange. Our children and us can go into any store, anytime, and just point at the things that we want. This is not what happened in the beginning of the 1900s. People, the most valuable people accepted to be treated as a part of mass because it gave them access to material wealth and goods. But this is not the case anymore because it has become a hygiene factor. We don't want to pay for the tram to come 5 minutes earlier. We just expect that it's going to come 5 minutes earlier. So it changes from an era where we're willing to pay for access to goods and material wealth to identity. Now, this is a slightly difficult to understand, but we have been working with creating identity for maybe 30 or 40 years through tools like design, advertising, communication, but it hasn't been put into the products themselves. The products themselves have been as stupid as they've ever been, but suddenly they've started to move identity into these products. Now, iTunes and Spotify is a brilliant example. This is a quote by Shoshana Zuboff's son, and he has said about iTunes is that they built a boat to put my life on, then they gave me a crew and made me the captain and told me I could sail wherever I want. Nobody could say that about radio because it doesn't work like that. But suddenly you got these products that are coming into the market, providing mass individualization and identity, and it turns into something people are much more willing to pay for. So the ideas that we've been working on in advertising design and communication for the last 20 or 30 years suddenly become much more important in the development of products themselves. And products haven't had these things before. That is a relatively new thing. The second thing is that, so when cars became affordable to everyone, you opened up massive new markets. You solved the premium puzzle of the 1900s. What is the premium puzzle of the 21st century? And it's individualization. If you look at the things you use the most, if you look at the world's most valuable companies, what do they have in common? Well, we are living in the age of mass individualization. No two people get the same Google search results. No two people get the same Amazon search results. No two people have the same Facebook feed. No two people have the same iTunes or Spotify catalog. And 2 minutes after you open your smartphone for the first time, it's completely unique to any other smartphone in the world. Now, we don't question this, but look back at your company or your clients' companies and ask them, how individualized is your products? Jeff Jarvis commented on this, and he said, the media companies of the world haven't seen how this has been playing out for the last 10 or 15 years. You can go to any newspaper and ask them, where does your customer work? And they wouldn't know. Google knows, Amazon knows, Facebook knows. And so mass individualization becomes the thing. So when we're looking at data, what are these new pools of data that we're trying to figure out where to look? We have to stop looking in this mass pools that are trying to help us with access to goods and material wealth. And we have to start looking much more into identity pools, and much more into individualization pools, and much more into convergence of industry pools. And this data has to be different, because the communication industry has had access to some of this data for some time, but in a format that's just impossible to give to a business. Because a business can't act on how many times a customer reads a newspaper. They need different types of parameters and different types of data. But we are at the forefront. We are, when I meet companies and we're talking about reorganizing organizations and understanding the future, it's usually the marketing and communications departments that are closest to achieving it, because they are the ones that actually are interested in figuring out what's happening with the customer. So, in this age of technology, it's important to remember that a revolution doesn't happen when society adopts new tools, but it happens when we adopt new behaviors. And I think that we are completely underestimating the changes in behaviors that are happening in our lives, because we're looking at old data, and old data is telling us that things look approximately the same as before. People just started using mobile phones. But the change is much, much bigger than that, but we don't have access to the right data that's going to tell us this. So again, we're just slamming into this wall, we're just speeding up this train unless we get the good data and good insights, and we're just rigging ourselves to crash and to get the shock. And so I think, in summary, that we really do need new models and methodologies that are able to fuel a new system of practice. We not only need new organizations, that won't help. We need new fuel to put into these organizations to solve the problems that we are going to face. Yes. As I said, I think the world looks like this. It's a hardware component that we are very aware of, but we have not spent enough time looking at the fuel, looking at the software component, looking at what is actually giving this hardware component its impulses. I think we have to admit that we have to feed these organizations with new types of data. They are too much in love with their core technology and their core business models to change. And if you look at, this is an example from a guy called Gary Hamel, and he says that if you look at HP, Microsoft, Dell, and Intel 10 years ago, they were all looking at mobile, and they were seeing mobile is going to be the next big thing. It's going to be so huge. This is going to be a threat. We're not going to do anything about it. Because it doesn't look like our core business model. It doesn't look like our core technology. We're doing PCs. We're doing laptops. Mobiles, we see is going to be a problem, but we have not got the capacity to solve it because we haven't got the data to make it important enough. I think we have to get organizations measured on looking at the human being, on looking at the jobs we're helping customers solve, instead of looking at the world through their own solutions. And I think we have to explore and enjoy the enormous mass of new data and capacity to handle this data that we're looking at, because at the moment we're not even flicking at it, because our mindset and our ideas and our creative intelligence is geared towards working with the old data instead of exploring all the new data. And I think there are ideas that we have that we just need to ramp up. Design thinking is a beautiful idea. It just doesn't work when the world around a company changes every 7 days or so. So how do you create an immediate system of action based around the thoughts of design thinking and implement it into a company that can create a continuous feedback loop? So, in conclusion, today's companies need insights to make decisions that challenge their assumptions and their core technologies, vectors, processes, and business models. Insight that challenge their customers' own perceptions of what they want, because customers don't even know what they want. And in a format and through a system that distributes this knowledge to every talent and every team, that distributes the knowledge to every talent and every team. Information today in modern organizations are hoarded by management. This has to be let go to everyone in the team and everybody in the company, so that everybody is empowered to make their own decisions in their own interactions with their customers, all in real time.
Jerry, just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helge. In the introduction, I already talked about there's two narratives in technology, and we focus too much on the second one, which is literally about the technicality and how to make things. I think Helge showcased a little bit more the importance of really understanding how it impacts human behavior and how massive that impact really is, and how we can get to start thinking about that differently. So we're now ready for a coffee break. We'll start again sharp at 12:15, so make sure you're back here at 5 after 12, 10 after 12, so we can start on time. Thank you.